Hello Human Body System students. Today we have our first lesson on the chemical communication system of the body, which is known as the endocrine system. So while we will be focusing on specifically endocrine signaling in this lesson, it's important to note that there are several different types of chemical signaling methods that the body carries out. First we have autocrine signaling. Auto in biology typically means self, and so autocrine signaling is when a cell is using chemicals to signal its own self. An example of this is when a cell needs to grow, it needs to expand, maybe it's getting ready to go through mitosis and divide. It will send certain chemicals to its own cell membrane to tell the membrane to start growing so the cell can be larger. Paracrine signaling. Para means close, and so paracrine signaling is signaling from cells to the cells that are immediately surrounding it, so like a little patch of cells that are all kind of touching each other. An example of this is you're familiar with already. Neurotransmitters are traveling between one axon terminal to the dendrite of another neuron, but they're right next to each other, so paracrine is signaling between cells that are right next to each other. So then endocrine signaling is carried out by glands in the body that secrete these substances called hormones, and these hormones go directly into the bloodstream and are carried to wherever in the body their target cells are, so wherever there are cells that have receptor proteins that those hormones can attach to. And then exocrine signaling, also carried out by glands, except for instead of going directly into the bloodstream, the substances secreted by these glands go into little ducts or tubes and then are taken to a very specific place to carry out a function in the body. Examples of exocrine glands are salivary glands, which have little tubes that bring the saliva directly into your mouth, lacrimal glands, which are basically your tear-producing glands, and they have little tubes that bring your tears directly to the outer surface of the eye, and then eccrine and apocrine glands are examples of sweat glands. And so you have a little sweat gland under the surface of your skin, and it has a little tube that carries sweat directly to the skin surface. Okay, so let's just get a little bit of vocabulary out of the way. Hormones are any kind of substances secreted by glands that influence other body systems in some way. When they bind to their target cells, they cause a response in the target cell. Target cells are just cells that the hormones can bind to in order to cause that response because they have those receptor proteins on them. So these receptor proteins, again, just a protein that a specific hormone can fit into to elicit a response in the target cell, very much the same way as the dendrites of a neuron have receptor proteins for specific neurotransmitters on them that come from the axon terminal of another neuron. Okay, let's start getting into the actual glands of the endocrine system. So first we have the thyroid. The thyroid is located anteriorly in the cervical region, so basically it's in the front of your neck. In fact, if you put your hand over the front of your throat and swallow, you can feel kind of a squishy thing moving up and down. That is your thyroid gland. It's in front of your larynx. So the main function of the thyroid gland is to regulate your body's metabolism, and then it also can help regulate blood calcium. So the hormones that are produced by the endocrine gland are T3, which helps to regulate metabolism, and T4, which helps to regulate the production of T3. And so if you are someone that has like hypothyroidism, low thyroid, you may have to take T3 and or T4 as a supplement to help your thyroid carry out its metabolic regulating processes if your thyroid can't produce enough of these hormones on its own. And then calcitonin is another hormone produced by the thyroid gland, which decreases blood calcium levels. Blood calcium, levels of essentially anything in the blood are really tightly regulated by the body. And so if blood calcium gets to be too high, then calcitonin is released by the thyroid and it stimulates the bones to reabsorb calcium back into the bones, like deposit that calcium into the bones to get it out of the blood. And then it will also influence the kidneys to allow more calcium to be excreted in urine. Next we have the parathyroid gland, and so this is posterior to the thyroid, actually kind of sitting on the back of the thyroid. So the parathyroid gland also plays a heavy role in regulating blood calcium. It produces this hormone called parathyroid hormone, often abbreviated as just PTH, And PTH, it has the opposite effect of calcitonin, because PTH, when blood calcium gets too low, the parathyroids will detect that, and then they release this parathyroid hormone that causes the body to increase its blood calcium level by influencing the bones to like liquefy a little bit of calcium out of the bone matrix and release it into the blood. And then it also will stimulate the kidneys to reabsorb more calcium from the urine. Next, we have the good old pancreas. The pancreas is located posteriorly to the stomach, so just behind the stomach in the abdomen. The main endocrine function of the pancreas is to regulate blood sugar. Now, the pancreas also plays an exocrine role in the body. If you look at the diagram over here, again, my little laser pointer is not working, but you can see that structure labeled the pancreatic duct. So in that duct is where certain digestive enzymes are emptied into the small intestine. But again, since there's a duct involved, that's an exocrine function. So the endocrine functions of the pancreas are to regulate blood sugar, and it does this through the production of two hormones. So first is insulin. Insulin causes a lowering of blood sugar when the body, there are insulin and blood glucose receptors all over the body, and when those receptors detect that the blood sugar or blood glucose level is too high, then it will signal the pancreas to release insulin, and the job of insulin is to lower the blood sugar by causing cells to pull in glucose and to store it. So essentially that is like the liver pulls in glucose and turns it into glycogen. Some of that glycogen will be stored in the liver, some of it will be stored in the skeletal muscles. And then also insulin can stimulate your fat cells to pull in the excess glucose where it can be converted into fat. The liver plays a really strong role in that too, but insulin is essentially storing of the sugar in the cells to get it out of the bloodstream. And then glucagon is the opposite of insulin because it raises blood sugar by causing cells to let out the stored glucose. So when blood sugar is too low, your body cells are deficient, they don't have enough glucose. The pancreas is signaled to release glucagon, and then glucagon really what it does is tell the liver to start converting that stored glycogen, which is a starch, start converting it into simple glucose molecules that can be rapidly released into the bloodstream so that the blood glucose will return to its stable homeostatic level. Next, we have the thymus gland. So this is medially located kind of in between the lungs. It's just behind the sternum. It's below, so I guess inferior to the thyroid gland, and it's quite a bit smaller. So the thymus gland plays a very strong role in regulating the immune system. It produces these hormones called thymosins. Now this is a really fairly broad category of a bunch of different hormones that fall under this umbrella, but for this class we're just going to think of them as thymosins. And the main function of thymosins is to help your immune system develop antibodies, so when there is a bacterial or viral infection and your immune system is working to manufacture antibodies, the thymus gland with its thymosins helps to encourage those antibodies to mature and develop faster. Next, we have the adrenal glands, and the adrenal glands are just little guys sitting right on top of the kidney like a little hat, superior to the kidneys. They play a very strong role in regulating your blood pressure. So the hormones that are produced by the adrenal glands that do this are, number one, cortisol. Cortisol is also called the stress hormone. It's been in the news a lot lately, in the last probably decade or so, for being a hormone that makes us fat and sick. So cortisol is released when the body is under stress. It stimulates the body to increase blood sugar levels, and some of this has to do with if you're in a stressful situation, you need to be able to produce a lot of ATP really fast so that you can like run away from a bear or whatever, and so it causes an increase in blood sugar. But if this happens due to the chronic stress that we feel in everyday life, chronic high blood sugar can also cause chronic high blood pressure. That's one of the effects of high blood glucose, is an increase in blood pressure. And so then that is very damaging to the endothelium of your blood vessels. And so that's why chronic high blood glucose is a problem, especially for like diabetics. And then another function of cortisol is that it suppresses the immune system. So again, increase of blood sugar is going to stimulate your fat cells to be trying to pull in that blood sugar to get it out of the bloodstream, so it'll stop damaging your blood vessels, and so then you get fat. And then the suppression of the immune system, you get sick. So chronic high cortisol is a problem that we face in modern day society. And then another hormone produced by the adrenal glands is called aldosterone. Aldosterone influences blood pressure by fiddling with sodium absorption. So they always say, like, don't eat too much salt or you'll have too high of blood pressure. We found out in recent years that this is not necessarily as true. We've learned that blood sugar plays a much stronger role in influencing blood pressure than sodium does. But sodium will be absorbed more from the body in the kidneys when aldosterone is present. So aldosterone increases the absorption of sodium. It also causes potassium to be secreted more into the urine, and then it causes the kidneys to reabsorb more water out of the urine. And so the more water there is in your blood, the more blood volume you have, and therefore the higher your blood pressure. Next, we have the ovaries and testes. Of course, ovaries being female hormones and testes being male hormones. So ovaries are located inferiorly in the abdomen, just above, just superior to the pelvic region. And the testes are actually located externally, inferior to the pelvic region. And the reason for this is that, reproductively, the sperm cells prefer a little bit cooler of a temperature to be formed properly. And so that's why the testes are external and the ovaries are internal. So these endocrine glands regulate the sexual characteristics of a human as well as reproductive systems. So the ovaries produce hormones called progesterone and estrogen, and these give the very typically physiologic female characteristics such as more fatty tissue development and distribution around the hips and thighs, and then the breast tissue development, all of the various female characteristics. And then the testes produce a hormone called testosterone. So now there's still testosterone in females, it's just not nearly as high of levels as testosterone is present in males. And testosterone promotes things like body hair development and muscle growth especially. And so these ovaries and testes, the hormones they produce, are down to the physiological differences that we see between male and female bodies. So now getting into the really important stuff, we have the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is also called the boss gland or the master gland. So this little gland is located just inferior to the hypothalamus. It's kind of dangling down beneath the brain a little bit. It's about the size of a pea. It has two lobes, an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe. And the pituitary gland basically controls all of the other endocrine glands through the release of hormones that regulate those other glands. So the anterior pituitary gland produces growth hormone, which stimulates the growth of all body tissues. It also produces a hormone called prolactin, which in women postpartum stimulates the production of milk in the mammary tissue. It also produces TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, which stimulates the release of thyroid hormones, that T3 and T4 that we talked about previously. TSH stimulates those to be released by the thyroid. Also ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is a hormone that stimulates the adrenal glands to produce their hormones. There's also FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone, which stimulates the production of gametes or egg cells in the gonads, specifically in females, and it can stimulate the production of sperm in males. There's also LH, or luteinizing hormone, which stimulates the release of the egg from the ovary during ovulation, and then also it plays a role in sperm production in the male testes. The posterior pituitary gland produces ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. So antidiuretic hormone stimulates water reabsorption in the kidneys. So when antidiuretic hormone is released, it is functioning to increase blood pressure, again by increasing blood water volume. There's also oxytocin, which I think is sometimes cutely referred to as the cuddle hormone or the snuggle hormone. So oxytocin plays a really strong role in bonding and some other reproductive actions. So oxytocin is like a happy hormone that's released when you snuggle anything. So like if you're cuddling with your cat or your dog at home or something, both of your little mammal brains are releasing a little bit of oxytocin to stimulate that bonding. It's really important for, if you've ever heard of skin to skin contact, which is really important for babies right after they're born. It's important for their skin to be in contact with their mother's skin or somebody's skin. and that's because that gives the little baby a flood of oxytocin in their brain, which is very good for them. There's also MSH, or melanocyte stimulating hormone. So melanocytes are the cells in the skin that produce melanin, the pigment that makes the skin have any color to it, gets darker, and so MSH will stimulate the production of melanin by those melanocytes. And then next we have the hypothalamus, which is sometimes referred to as the receptionist of the brain. The pituitary is the boss and the hypothalamus is the receptionist. And if anybody has parents that work in an office, I think we all know who the actual boss of things is. So the hypothalamus is located deep inside the brain, just inferior to the lobes of the cerebrum. It essentially takes in sensory information from the body to tell the pituitary gland what is up with the body, and then it releases hormones that stimulate the pituitary gland to then release all of its regulating hormones. So this hypothalamus is essentially the link between the nervous and endocrine systems, because it is detecting all that stimulus from the body and then telling the endocrine system how to react to it. So the hypothalamus produces also antidiuretic hormone, which again regulates blood pressure by affecting the blood water volume. It releases CRH, or corticotropin releasing hormone, which stimulates the release of gonadotropin in the pituitary. It also produces GHRH, or growth hormone releasing hormone, which is what stimulates the pituitary to release growth hormone. It produces TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone, which stimulates the thyroid to, or stimulates the pituitary to release thyroid stimulating hormone, which then in turn stimulates the thyroid to release T3 and T4. It also produces some oxytocin. So the pineal gland is located just posterior to the hypothalamus, superior to the brainstem, and the main role of the pineal gland is to produce this hormone called melatonin, and melatonin helps to regulate sleep and wake cycle in your brain. And so that's why if you're experiencing some temporary insomnia, sometimes they will recommend that you take some melatonin to help kind of influence that pineal gland. All right, so hormones work in feedback systems. So there are two general types of feedback in the human body. First is positive feedback. So positive feedback occurs when some kind of stimulus moves the body away from homeostasis. That stimulus will then trigger some kind of reaction in the body that takes the body even further away from homeostasis. So this is less common than negative feedback, but some examples of positive feedback systems in the body are pregnancy and birth. And so when a female becomes pregnant, then the resulting kind of hormone cascades result in the baby growing and the placenta growing, and so it's taking that woman's body further and further and further away from homeostasis, because of course homeostasis is just existing, not pregnant. And then blood clotting is another example, because homeostasis, you're not clotting blood, right? It would be really bad if you were clotting your blood all over in your body all the time, but when there is some type of injury to the tissue, then the tissue in that area will release some blood clotting factors, and then the release of those blood clotting factors leads to the release of some more blood clotting factors, and so it's kind of like a cascade leading up to the blood clot that will stop the bleeding. Negative feedback is when you have a stimulus that moves the body away from homeostasis. The reaction that's triggered is to bring the body back to its homeostatic levels of whatever it is. So examples of this are temperature regulation. If you get too hot, your body's going to try to cool you off. If you get too cold, your body's going to try to warm you up. Blood sugar or blood glucose regulation. Again, blood sugar goes too high, pancreas is going to try to bring it down. Blood sugar goes too low, pancreas is going to try to bring it up. And many, many other different types of hormonal mechanisms in the body are examples of negative feedback. So here are just some examples of specific ways that hormones kind of regulate things or regulate each other. So first we have stimulation and suppressant pairs. So this is when you have one hormone that stimulates the production of another hormone, and then when that second hormone is produced, it suppresses the production of the first hormone. So an example of this is when you have FSH, or follicle stimulating hormone. That stimulates the ovaries to secrete estrogen, and then when estrogen levels get high enough, those high estrogen levels suppress the production of FSH. So it's kind of like the one raises the other, and then when the other is raised, it brings the first one back down. Next, we have antagonistic pairs. So this is two hormones that work together with opposite effects in order to maintain homeostasis. So a very good example of this is good old insulin and glucagon. So insulin lowers the blood sugar when it's too high, and then glucagon will raise the blood sugar when it is too low. So they kind of work against each other to maintain the homeostatic blood glucose level in the body. And last, we have the stimulus and response type of relationship. So this is when a hormone that is secreted is either increased or decreased by the substance that it is regulating. And so, for example, we've got blood calcium. So when you have high blood calcium levels in the body, this suppresses the production of parathyroid hormone, because remember, parathyroid hormone's role is to raise blood calcium levels. So when you have high blood calcium, it suppresses parathyroid hormone, and when you have low blood calcium levels, it stimulates the production of parathyroid hormone. So it's not two hormones that are interacting, it's one hormone, parathyroid hormone, interacting with the substance that it regulates, which is calcium. All right, and finally here, just the classes of hormones. So the different types of kind of substances that these hormones are made out of in the human body. So first we have amine hormones. These are derived from a single amino acid, so these are kind of small little protein-based hormones. There are peptide hormones, which are bigger. They are actual full proteins. They're made of chains of amino acids. And then lastly, there are steroid hormones, which are derived from cholesterol, which is produced by your liver. And these types of hormones are made of fats or lipids.